Okay, just in the interest of time, we'll get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are logging in from. My name is Shannon Bracken. I'm the Director of Admissions and Recruitment at Ontario Tech University, but I'm doing this intro in my role as a member of the Professional Development Committee with International ACAC, and then you'll hear from me again as a panelist on this session. But welcome to the first International ACAC Webinar Week. With the support of members from around the world, the Professional Development Committee is hosting this new and exciting event. It started last week and it continues until tomorrow, where each day of the week we have a different theme. We've had some great sessions and themes so far. Today we're going to be talking about testing, and tomorrow our final day will be around professional development, and particularly in admissions practices. You will have the opportunity to watch and engage in the live sessions on these topics. As well, there is a list of suggested recorded presentations from previous conferences to deepen your knowledge in the daily theme, and those are available on the event website. When you've soaked up all you can from the live and recorded sessions, please head over to the Facebook group to discuss your thoughts, tips, and tricks with other members participating in Webinar Week. So just a few housekeeping notes. You will be able to use the chat and Q&A functions to interact with the panel and ask all of your questions. As well, this session is being recorded, and all recordings from all of the webinars we posted over the past week are added onto the International ACAC webinar archives on the website. And so all of the previous ones are currently there, and this one will be added shortly afterwards today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Clay to kick things off.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm very excited about this webinar. It's a great topic. It's very timely to discuss. We also have an extraordinary panel of experts, including Shannon, but also Cuca Acosta from UC Santa Barbara, Sean Felton from Cornell University, and Bobby Fernando from New York University, NYU. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. But before we turn it to them for their elevator speeches, would love for you guys to, while you're settling in and while our panel of experts are introducing themselves, please take advantage of the chat feature. As Shannon mentioned, let us know where you are from. And for those at universities, what are some key insights or surprises that you have seen especially in the world of testing, but also just student mobility in general and the impact of test option or the post-ACT world on student mobility and college admissions. If you're in the counseling field, feel free to add comments here as well. You can also use the questions throughout, but let's get the comment field filled up as we go. So these are our panelists. And I would like to start with Cuca. Cuca, tell us about your journey and also, your trajectory, but also the transition over the past year of how the UC system, but particularly Santa Barbara, has used testing. Cuca.
Thank you so much, Clay. Hi, everyone. I'm Cuca Acosta. I'm the Associate Director for Admissions at the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. I have the distinct pleasure of being in the University of California system. My campus has been my home for 19 years as a professional. So I've seen the ups and downs of the exam process, from having it required with the writing section, from having required SAT subject tests, from having a review process to see whether or not we should have the SAT writing section mandated, to today having us be test free, which means that the Office of Admissions, not just at UC Santa Barbara, but all the UC campuses, are cannot view an SAT or an ACT in the admissions review process for our freshman applicants, which makes life really interesting when we receive about 110,000 freshman applications at UC Santa Barbara. I look forward to telling you more about UC Santa Barbara and my UC system, and I'll turn it over or back to Clay for our additional panelists.
Well, let's go next to Bobby. Bobby, tell us about NYU, Test Flex for all to Test Optional for all.
Thank you, Clay. Hi, everyone. My name is Bobby Fernando. I I'm the Senior Director of Global Admissions at NYU, and in that capacity, I oversee the international admissions that come to our New York campus, as well as all admissions to our campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. Fun fact about me, as I was telling Cooper last time, I used to live in Santa Barbara. I am definitely very jealous of her when I'm sitting here in 20-degree weather in New York. I miss it. It's a beautiful place. But always happy to talk about at the amazing campuses in New York, Abu Dhabi, and Shanghai as well. I cannot compete with her 19 years, but I have been at NYU for 12 years, which has been an incredible journey. Before that, I was based in the UK. I worked in various forms of international education before I came to the US, naively thinking that US admissions was going to be just like UK admissions. And I very quickly learned that it was nothing like it. So I definitely have my own kind of interesting learning curve with that. It's also been extremely interesting to see NYU's journey within testing throughout my time at NYU. So when I first joined NYU, we were test rigid, is that a term? I don't know, but we used to require SAT and ACT, and that was pretty much it. And about a year, 2 years after I started, then we moved to test flexible, which meant that we would accept a variety of different exams, mostly international exams, IB, A-levels, French bac, etc., in addition to the SAT or the ACT. And that number of tests grew significantly over the years and became a big part of our application process. We moved to partially test optional pre-COVID because we moved to test optional for our artistic applications. So students who were submitting a portfolio or an audition did not need to submit alternative testing as well. And then during COVID, we moved to fully test optional. And we are currently doing that year by year. So we have extended for another year. And we will see what the future brings, but looking forward to an interesting conversation here today.
Thank you, Bobby. And NYU indeed has been a pioneer, not only in terms of testing policy, but with its 3 global campuses that Bobby oversees, Greenwich Village and Brooklyn, which is where I'm located. And Bobby's over just right across the harbor there in Staten Island, which sometimes she'll joke that you need a passport to get into, even though they've had a good weekend there. And we've gone from the largest public system, one of the largest public systems in the world, the UCs, one of the largest private universities in the world, NYU, and then now back to a public. So Shannon, tell us about your journey, how you arrived at Ontario Tech, and then your policies from a Canadian and international perspective.
Sure. So again, everyone, hi, I'm Shannon Bracken. I'm the Director of Admissions and Recruitment at Ontario Tech University. So Ontario Tech is a public university in Canada. So I'm here as your non-US university today. So we're just about 40 minutes from downtown Toronto. We're in the Greater Toronto area. So we have about 10,000 students, which makes us, in Canadian standards, that's considered a smaller university, not by any means the smallest, but on the smaller side of things. So I've been at the university for the better part of 15, 16 years. Largely my time has been spent in international recruitment, although now I oversee admissions and recruitment for all undergraduate students, both domestic and international. In terms of our approach to the SAT, we have a very common approach to for a Canadian institution. We don't require the SAT. We are a school that also does not require it for US patterned curriculum students, regardless of where they studied. We use the SAT in a way that a student can submit it to help their application, but they're never hindered for not submitting an SAT. And it would be a small percentage of our applicants that would submit an SAT. It is typically students that are kind of on the borderline of whether they would be admitted. If they had a strong SAT, we would possibly consider that in our review process. Looking back at the past 2 years, we have seen a slight increase in students submitting SAT than we have previously seen, which I think is students looking to supplement their applications just because various exams have been canceled, their school years have been adjusted, and so they're, I think, they've done the SAT as sort of another thing to just kind of help their application. But that's basically our approach. And I don't think it's an uncommon one for a Canadian institution.
So for most Canadians, Shannon, who could submit a CEE, an ACT or SAT, you really wouldn't look at that at all for those.
For a Canadian student, no.
Right.
So for a student, we're in Ontario, so a student that would be coming from the Ontario high school system, we wouldn't consider it at all. A student coming from outside, I guess maybe we would look at it, but I can't think of one example in my 15 years where a Canadian student has submitted an SAT. Most Canadians who choose to write the SAT, it's because they're going to the US or they're considering going to the US. And so that's really, I think, the bulk. It's not, standardized testing in Canada is not very common to begin with. It's not really built into our education system. There are some standardized tests, to just get some data points for the ministries of education, like in grade 3 and grade 6, there's some tests, and there's a literacy test students have to do in grade 10. But they're by no means standardized testing for entrance to Canadian universities, so it's just not a common practice for us.
And we'll continue to flesh that out, where, because we do have international AC members that aren't US pattern schools, obviously, that follow a British curriculum or a local curriculum, and then your expectations for them or how you would use it. We'll talk about that. But to move on to Sean, who is actually probably receiving some of those Canadian students, particularly athletes, hockey as well as scholars, but with the NCAA not requiring it anymore. And Sean will tell us about your journey at Cornell, and you have one of the more complex policies, I would say. Articulate that for us. So.
Absolutely. And by the way, yes, we will take all of the Canadian hockey players and soccer players. So yes, all of that. But it's great to be with everybody today. My name is Sean Felton. I'm Executive Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Cornell, and I'm working on year 19 at Cornell. Surprise, surprise, surprise. My journey with global higher ed began in graduate school. Many of you might recall the language exams that you have to master and finish to get out of graduate school. So that was my sort of real kind of immersion. And then of course, the University of Virginia, where I went to undergrad and grad school, I worked in the admissions office there, go Who's. And that was my first moment to really kind of delve into international admissions and education, even more so at that point. So, and I've been at Cornell ever since, or for the last 19 years, ever since leaving UVA, go Big Red. And Cornell, I think, as you guys all know, is focused on diversity of person, practice, and thought. So best known for the academic diversity, the ever-growing academic diversity. We're adding a new college next fall. Stay tuned. And, as far as undergraduate testing requirements, we used to be one of those schools that just required the SAT or the ACT for everybody. It was never a question. We didn't actually waive it. The only possibility of getting it waived before the pandemic was if it wasn't offered in your country, we just sort of reviewed your application without it. The pandemic changed everything, and our sort of legacy testing policy with regard to the SAT and ACT adjusted because of the needs of the applicants with whom we are working. And Cornell, in its sort of own kind of complex state of mind, always, we went to a very complex testing policy where half of our undergraduate colleges were traditionally test optional in this sort of new realm, new space. And the other half moved to being test or score free for standardized testing purposes for undergraduate admissions review of first-year students. So that's been really interesting. It does mean for a little bit of a longer introduction and explanation, but hey, we're used to that. It's okay. We get more time. We like it.
I appreciate that. And as we move on to our agenda, and emphasizing that Cornell it's an Ivy, it's part of that lovely football conference that we like to talk about. It's a SUNY, so part of the State University of New York, so public.
Affiliated with SUNY, yes.
Affiliated with SUNY. and it's a Morrill land grant university, one of the only two private original land grants with MIT, which we'll talk about later, has gone a different direction of testing. But if you're a history of higher ed, Tuskegee is also a land grant in Alabama, technically private, but also a land grant, just to give them credit, Joe Montgomery there. Now, so I'm going to try to move my slide forward. There we go. And my name is Clay Hensley. Shannon introduced me earlier. I'm an independent consultant working in international ed, and we would like to thank our sponsors. A number of these I'm currently working with, including CIALFO, Cambridge, and IELTS. Among others, but we want to thank our great sponsors that are helping us do the conference as well as perform these webinars. In terms of how we want to spend the rest of the time today, this was our rapid round of introductions to center us and to provide that context. I'm going to give a little bit more context, but I'm going to be very brief in showing a few slides, and then we're going to move on to a discussion centered on 4 topics. The truth will set you. We're going to talk about test-free admission and the impact, particularly of the California system. Cook is going to go into a bit more detail there with our Cal State colleagues, Cal Tech, WPI, and others who have gone that route, with Sean in a hold my beer moment, with the fact that at least half of his colleges are also not looking at scores and are free. How the reading process, reading the room, Bobby's going to lead there. We're going to talk about what this means for going back to the future of mobility and being on the road again, and how universities through their yield process, as well as just student engagement as you move forward, what we expect the role of testing to be there and what you're seeing, and then what's new and next in higher ed admissions. We're going to look at a crystal ball and then have time for your question and answer. So that's how we're going to run the show here. I'm going to move forward. I just wanted to visualize real quick what you heard verbally spoken. And that's that during the pandemic, there was a variety of policies, but you see that most were clustered, with the exception of our Canadian colleague, Shannon at Ontario Tech. They were always score free or test optional, whereas everyone else was on the right side of either test flex, NYU pioneering that policy, which also Rochester, Colorado College had, but NYU was first, and then everyone else was test required. Then during the pandemic, everyone clustered more toward either test optional, or in the case of UC Santa Barbara and at least half of Cornell, score free. So that's the visualization of the trajectory of what we had. I borrowed this from our friend Akil Bello, who's also coined the term highly rejective, which I think everyone here is sort of highly rejective. So I hope I'm not offending anyone there, but I just saw that term in the Wall Street Journal and was really proud of Akil for coining it. These are at least Akil Bello's FAIR test is Akil's organization, how he defines some of these terms. You'll have these slides and we'll give them after the session with an appendix. There continues to be a range of current policies and postures that are changing daily. So in terms of, the only university that I'm aware of that continued to require, and I could be off here, but at least the largest system to continue requiring the test during the pandemic were Florida public schools. Then temporary suspension of the requirement, but then are now moving forward to require, include the Georgia public schools plus North Carolina. These are regent run, so it's not decisions made by admission officers, but instead those that are appointed to the regents. And right now these are Republican states, plus Georgetown and more recently MIT. Test flexible pre-COVID, but then test optional NYU. You'll have these slides, so I'm not going to go through each one. But then other flavors include test optional for 1 year and evaluating each cycle. This would be Northeastern, Cornell, NC State, Vanderbilt, and so forth. Yale, Harvard, and so many of the Ivies. Let's go back. And then multi-year evaluation. You have a bigger group. And then you're starting to get into those test-free areas. Those that were test-free spurred by COVID, UC, Cal State, Caltech, Cornell, WPI, and so forth. But then there's a whole group, there is a group, Hampshire, Pensacola, that were test-free even prior to COVID. So again, I want to thank Akil and Adam Ingersoll for helping me with that designation. Common App reports very little change in score submitting patterns from the first year of COVID, 2020, 21 until now. Just a very small tick up. Note that Common App does not include the UCs or CSU. So really those numbers are lower overall, but they are representative of about 800 schools. Many are internationally engaged. So before the pandemic, more than 3/4 of students submitted scores. After the pandemic, it was 43, tipped up slightly, but this is really not much. It's really the same. About less than half of students are submitting scores. And according to Common App, the students that are less privileged, that are low income, that are that are underrepresented minorities, that are female, or that are international are submitting at a lower rate. It's the students submitting most are those that are more affluent and are more white. Those international students, low income students, underrepresented minorities, and females are the ones not submitting many scores. I do want to note that test optional policies combined with other factors, including, what we're calling the Biden-Harris bounce, seems to be igniting a growth in international applications. Now, I think some of this may be the rich getting richer, so it's not seen by all institutions, and we are isolating the US. Apologies to my Canadian friend Shannon, but I think you're seeing growth too. But according to the Common App, even though applications grew 12% among domestic, almost 3 times that rate of growth was seen for international students during that same time period. So larger growth than international. Now we're going to move on to topics. I want you to be able to see our speakers and react to each other. So I'm going to stop sharing. And here we go. Kuka, you get the first question in our Truth Will Set You free section. How did your shift to test-free impact how you recruited and evaluated international applicants to Santa Barbara? Kuka.
All right, so I get the easy question. I love that. I will point out that in the process of the University of California as a system, the conversation about how we were using the SATs did not start with COVID, did not start with the pandemic. The faculty across the 9 undergraduate campuses had already been doing a year-long study about the effectiveness of the exams in the admissions process, which conveniently ended in March when 2020, when the pandemic hit. So the conversation of because of the pandemic, we switched is actually not 100% true. So the faculty were evaluating one of our 14 factors of admission in the University of California's holistic review process. Most counselors didn't know about the other factors. In fact, it's kind of simple to be looked at in a spreadsheet at an admissions guide as we're at an international fair, or as we were talking with a high school counselor abroad. And how do you help a student understand their chances? Well, there's the GPA, which isn't common when you're on an A level versus a traditional versus a 0 to 100 scale or IB. So what is there that's pretty remarkable across the board was the SAT or ACT exams. So having that as a benchmark was pretty easy to talk about with students. Well, our faculty recognized, and they had a conversation that of the factors, 13 held true. So I'm putting those in the chat box for you for reference, right? And the removal of the SAT and the ACT exam for international students all of a sudden opened the floodgates, because I didn't have to fly to Hong Kong to take the test. I didn't have to fly to, Hawaii to take the test from Asia. I was able to take the coursework that I had at my school and say, this is who I am. And to add the flavor of here's what I've done outside of the classroom in the UC application. So removing a component actually opened up our resources for international students, and thus opened up the application for many students who in the past hadn't seen it as an option. So for us, the recruitment process was one that actually was beneficial to students to a degree. The comment that I'll put out there, and then I'll throw it back to you, Clay, is that just because the removal of the SAT or the ACT exams was off the table, it doesn't mean that now it's so much easier to read an application. Now the other components, the other 13 factors are being looked at. And so a student now has more responsibility on their plate to tell us the context of their academic accomplishments, to tell us the context of their personal accomplishments in our very centered UC application, which has no interviews, no letters of recommendation. So a student now needs to advocate more for themselves. So is it easier? That's the $40,000 question right there that I'll leave in your hands. But that's the fun aspect of the University of California and sort of the recruitment arm.
That's perfect. That was a great explanation. And I'm really glad you added that those factors that you put in the chat are all centered on the academic record, reviews in context, but that context is very key. Now, Sean, I'm going to punt to you though. In terms of, we mentioned holding our beers, because as much as UC had this major shift, Cornell also had this major shift, but between colleges and the different systems, what are some of the insights that you saw from the score-free or test-free perspective, and some being test optional? What patterns are you seeing, and how do you articulate them?
Well, at the time, I feel like the decision was easy and the explanation is hard. At the time, we were already needing to retrain and reimagine the selective admissions process, the review process. And, I think that our switch to a bifurcated SAT, ACT policy amongst all of our undergraduate units is really about people here caring, because those decisions were made by separate groups. The undergraduate colleges are discrete and distinct in that way. Applicants apply directly to a college here. So there was a bit of care and concern involved, but I do think that the decision was easier, and the explanation and sort of conversation about it is much harder. Part of that is because of, or at least I would say the sort of the integration of this and making it work and understanding of this is really best viewed through a sort of lens of how Cornell does its admissions work anyway. And it's really a localized, holistic review that's happening here, meaning it's a very college-specific, college-oriented review. And so each college committee and their faculty, if you will, for our Canadian friends, we're able to decide that, it's okay, in the case of the Agriculture and Life Sciences College with 22 programs, the Business College with the Dyson program, and the Nolan School of Hotel Administration, and then our Architecture, Art, and Planning, Urban and Regional Studies programs. It's okay in those particular areas to not utilize testing at all. The committees decided for themselves, and it was really just left up to the rest of us to communicate this and help people understand. And I will tell you, I thought it was kind of crazy for the business college here at Cornell to sort of say, we don't need the SAT math score. We're not even going to do test optional. We don't need it. We don't need it. And they figured out a way to make that work in terms of how they were reviewing candidates and the other information that was already being submitted and already available. So I give them a lot of credit for seeing an opportunity there that I didn't see immediately. And that I worried for them, because that's one of our single most desired programs. And, a test score is a way to kind of move through applications in a way. The other group was our traditionally test optional group, arts and sciences. Actually, it's interesting. It's the bigger colleges, right? Arts and sciences with 40 plus majors, 30,000 apps. Engineering, 15,000 apps. 14 or so different major programs, or more actually at this point. The ILR school, also test optional, and then the Human Ecology College, also test optional. And again, these decisions were made by the college committees and their deans and their leadership. And I just think that they made the best decision that they could at the time, and they wanted to be most helpful. In terms of decision making, we again had to retool and retrain, and we've had no problem making decisions without test scores in the score-free environments. In most every single case, we've actually done this whole thing where you kind of imagine a review sort of moment without test scores. We did a practice run at this about 20 years ago, when Doris Davis was still here as our sort of supreme leader for enrollment. So we've sort of imagined that this might happen at some point. We've sort of known, we've not had a sort of smoke colored lenses on about this, but it's actually been fine. I think what we've just determined though is that we need to further adjust our review processes and information that we collect and how we collect it in order to make decisions better as a committee, as an individual college, without test scores. They were so deeply ingrained in our process. As I mentioned, everyone submitted. There was no exception unless it wasn't offered in Iran, for example. We had to basically just adjust from that to, if you're applying to the S.C. Johnson College of Business, they now care more about whether or not you have a calculus class on your transcript than and they don't care about an SAT math score at a program that's getting 4,000 or 5,000 applications for 179 spots. So I mean, it's really it put us in a space where we had to sort of adjust, and the results have been pretty good. I would say, again, the hardest thing about all of this has not been making decisions. It's been explaining this and making sure people are aware that, just because we don't have a test score, especially for the traditionally test optional colleges at Cornell, you're not disadvantaged in the process. You're not going to have a lesser review. We use the information we do have for you if you've made the choice to not submit a test score in making your admission decision.
And it seems to, I mean, not only has it been, well, less disruptive, it sounds like you've made it transformational. And it's a way in which,
I'm shocked about it, right? I mean,
right. And it's also a way to distinguish. I mean, I'm sure, as we were talking before, individual colleges, like MIT, have made decisions based on their needs and research. And then, but those that have gone a different direction, that's a distinguishing factor now. And Bobby, I'm curious where you sit there, but also because, speaking of transformational, that pioneering effort to make a policy that was flexible, student-centered in that way. Where have you seen some of the nuance in that shift, Bobby?
So I will start by 100% echoing what Sean said about trying to convince students that when we say we're test optional, we actually mean that. And you can genuinely put forward a compelling application and be evaluated and have a good chance of success without submitting testing. And that's a battle that we've had for the past 10 years since we became test flexible. So that's kind of definitely something that we've seen with test flexible through test optional. We definitely saw some shifts. I mean, even though we have been test flexible for 10 years, it was still only a relatively small number of students that took advantage of that across the three campuses. And there was still a kind of, I mean, when you look at our entire population, domestic and international, obviously SAT and ACT was still kind of the bulk of the testing that we saw. And even internationally, there are so many school systems that don't result in final exams, international students that are in US school systems where they were heavily reliant on the SAT or the ACT. So it wasn't as kind of small a shift as you might think it would be. We were perhaps prepared for it because of the fact that we have been test optional, we have been test flexible. But I think the journeys that other folks went through were something that we also went through. We definitely when we saw that, that big increase in kind of students going to test optional. We'll talk a little bit more later about how we evaluated them. But it was definitely a kind of a big shift for us as well.
How many applications did you receive, Bobby?
We got 105,000 applications.
Oh.
So that was a challenge in and of itself. And I mean, I totally get that highly rejective kind of piece of it. But I mean, we ended up admitting 12, just over 12% of our pool this year, which was tough. And I was actually just emailing a counselor this week and saying I kind of liked it better when we were admitting 35% because it was more fun. You know, you could kind of admit all of these incredible kids, and now I'm, we're getting to a point that that we're denying incredible kids, and I don't think there's anyone in this panel that would say, oh, that's fun. It's like this is the least favorite part of any of our jobs, I think. So it was tough, but it was a sizable volume,
and very few institutions. So that's a whole different session. I see Christopher is among our participant list. Christopher, I think we need a whole another session on that particular topic. I think only UCLA, Kuka, I mean, your lesser peer there, sorry, only received more applications than that, Bobby. I could be wrong there, but I think they were at about 120,000, and then you guys at 105. Oh, really? Okay. Kuka was indicating it's even higher. And Shannon, from a Canadian's perspective, what does this all mean, especially recruiting STEM students, which you guys are really focused on, one of the best in the world? Can you talk about that as we shift to the next topic, Shannon?
Yeah, and I think if you can let me nerd out for a second, if any of you are fans of Malcolm Gladwell, his podcast Revisionist History has an excellent episode, and I'd have to look to see which episode it is. He's Canadian, for those of you that don't know. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto. And he does an episode of his podcast where he talks about the differences between the Canadian higher ed system and the US. Obviously, he lives in the US now, and that's where a lot of his work is. And he has a way of framing it where the Canadian system is a mass education system. And so a lot of the difference, and this is his quote, this is not mine, in Canada, it's about educating as many people at the higher ed level and getting as many through the system versus almost being this like exclusive, like, oh, you can't go here, like we have a smaller admission rate, things like that. And he does a much better way of explaining it than I can, but it's a really interesting approach because I think a lot of this ties into that. And in our system, a lot of it is, will the student be successful? That's our ultimate bottom line. And we're trying to, every year we're like, can we admit more students? Can we grow our enrollment? Those are very frequent conversations that we have. And when it comes to things like the SAT and testing, we only use the SAT for international students, right? We don't use it for Canadian students. And the more competitive that the international student landscape is, it used to be where only a handful of Canadian universities were really active, and it's really grown, particularly over the last decade or so, where it's now just, you need international students. We are a publicly funded, many of us would say that we're more publicly assisted than funded in our institutions at this point. And we need revenues, right? And we are businesses at the end of the day. And the international student demographic is a big part of that. And I think the more competitive we are, I think the more we're kind of challenging ourselves, like, well, is this necessary, right? And I think there's been some shifts. I mean, my school's policy on the SAT didn't really change because pre-pandemic, it was exactly the same it is now, right? If you want to submit it, go for it, but like, we're not really asking you for it. We might look at it, we might not. And I think there were some institutions that were very, okay, if you come from a US school, if you're at the American school in Dubai, you must submit an SAT because that is reflective of the US pattern system. I think that's over the pandemic is where there have been some changes in kind of SAT policies in Canada. Not to say that all have changed that, but that's where I've seen there's been a bit of adjustments. And so I think for us, it's just a different approach in how we look at testing and our approach to, we actually, we're trying to increase the enrollment at most of our schools. And if I go back to the Malcolm Gladwell podcast, he talks about the size of an institution like the University of Toronto. I want to say about 85,000, 90,000 full-time students. I don't know if there are schools that big in the US. My guess is if there are, there's only a handful of them. But they're the largest in Canada. But there's a lot in the 50,000, 60,000 enrollment in Canada. And so it's just, I think, a different approach.
It's a different scale, it's a different approach,
Yeah.
and a different view of globalization. Shannon, remind me, Ontario Tech, what percentage are from outside of Canada?
So we're about 8% international. So,
Okay.
So that's about 800 students. So again, small, but we're on an active growth. So our president wants us to get to 15% international in about 3 years. It's a fairly aggressive target, but it's not impossible. We're on track to do it. But there's definitely a push to increase.
Just to level set, Bobby, you guys are higher than that. You're for your incoming class. Yeah.
Yeah, we're close to a quarter, usually kind of between about 20-25%. But when I first started at NYU, then it was about 13% of the incoming class. And the same, we had that institutional priority to increase the international enrollment. And I think, when you get that as a kind of a top-down effort, then it gives so much more weight to it. That was actually one of the ways that we were able to move to our test flexible policy, was because this was an institutional effort. And it's harder when you're kind of trying to do this from the bottom up and say, hey, can we change these policies to increase international enrollment, if they're not looking to necessarily drive that. But if you're getting that push from the top down, then you can say, well, yes, we can do this, but we need A, B, and C to do it. And you have that much more kind of ability to make change in your processes and your policies. So that was something that was incredibly helpful at NYU, and definitely allowed us to increase the international student population.
And I would say, you guys, and just browsing all four of your websites, you do mention, Shannon, on yours, you mentioned, of course, the British pattern system, A levels, IGCSE, and how you look at those, but also GAL-CAL, French Bac, the Caribbean exams, CAPE, and then the WIEC, the West African examinations. Bobby, I know that you've trained your staff in terms of professional development. Kuka, Sean, you guys as well. Kuka, you're a public institution. California, out-of-state students, it's not without controversy. Where are you guys landing this year in terms of your international enrollment?
It is a conversation piece. Politics does play a role in a public university because they hold a lot of our purse strings. For Santa Barbara's campus, we've got about 26,000 total students, of which 23,000 are undergraduate, and such a conversation because we can't grow. A third of campus is surrounded by the Pacific Ocean, so we can't move that way. The Santa Barbara airport is another third of campus, so we can't move that way. So for us, the county dictates our student enrollment. And so for us, there's about 11% of our students who are international, about 2,500 students total, which doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things, but it becomes a conversation when we can't accommodate growth for our California students as well.
And Sean, where are you guys landing this year around the percentage of international students?
You mean new internationals?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I'm actually looking that up right now.
Well, then let's move to Bobby as you look it up. And I I put the one episode of the Malcolm Gladwell Pushkin revisionist history. I did lower the rankings because it was actually saved in my files. But as Shannon noted in the chat, there's some really good comparative system ones that are easy to find once you get into that website. Bobby, let's move forward quickly. And let's just talk a little bit. We've hit upon them, but you're reading an evaluation process. Let's hit a few points there because I think this is something that counselors have been asking a lot about and how they convey it to students. So I think you can help them out giving some insights there, Bobby.
Sure. I think training, preparation, all kind of, the key words here. We definitely came to it from perhaps a kind of a slightly better place in that we did have some of those programs that have been test optional, like I said, for the artistic programs. And also the fact that we've been test flexible. So we were coming at this from a place where we were already looking at kind of evaluating different applicants for different contexts. We've always talked at NYU about contextual evaluation rather than holistic evaluation. And so that's something that we really have been very focused on for many years, even before the pandemic. Having said that, then we wanted to make sure that we did this right. And so, when we've had this conversation before, I talked about the fact that we spent a lot of time in preparation for this going into, so this would have been summer 2020, kind of, knowing that we were going into a test optional year, fully test optional year, and we hadn't done it at that scale before, making sure that we had a team that was kind of working on calibrating our decision making across kind of testing provided versus test optional. And so it was definitely kind of something that we spent a lot of time and effort planning as a small kind of team, and then rolling out and training the kind of the larger committee, and then doing work on the back end. It's kind of you set things up, you train people, then obviously you have to kind of go back and make sure that those decisions are making sense. So I think a lot of what we did, I would say in summer 21 leading into this cycle, is really kind of going back through some of those decisions that we made in the first year of test optional, identifying some kind of points of growth where we needed to kind of, to develop things out a little bit more. There were definitely, I would say, some school systems that were perhaps more disadvantaged in a test optional landscape because they had things like kind of limited grades that were available from the school. So the school doesn't provide a lot of grades, or motivational grading. You have or you just have kind of some schools that have, the teachers are just not generous in their kind of, in the way that they grade. So really going back, identifying where are those risk areas, so that in this cycle, we could be much more proactive in kind of in identifying them, going through them and checking them throughout the process to make sure that, that we were being equitable to all students. I mean, I know standardized testing has its faults, but I think it does to a certain extent what it says on the box, and it standardizes things, and it's how you use it that I think is sometimes problematic. But I think that the standardized piece of it can be helpful in the right context, not as a driver of decisions, but in the right context to help you kind of calibrate decisions. So you take that away, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to work, I would say, a lot harder to make sure that you are calibrating those decisions, you're being equitable. And also we needed to do a deeper dive into some of the curriculums that we were looking at. Sean mentioned already things like, the business school and kind of, and are the students calc ready? And you can do that without having an SAT to guide that decision. But you need to know, when you get a high school transcript from Poland and it just says, the student did mathematics, did that contain the sufficient amount of calc to prepare the students to go into, into that level of education? So definitely kind of, some of the nuances there. I think that the first year of kind of preparation was just, let's do the best we can possibly do. And then this summer and this year has been more about kind of tweaking around the edges to make sure that that students were not disadvantaged in any way. Because I think, we all, that's why we do what we do, is to try and make the kind of the right decisions for all of these students.
And in the diversity of the international type of applications that you're receiving, you've probably gained a lot of currency within not only NYU. I think the American higher ed ecosystem is also diverse, but we haven't always acknowledged how decentralized the system is. But your staff has gained that expertise, and I hope your domestic readers are gleaning that information from you as well. And in terms of just enhancing that idea of match, I also hear you. I used to work for the College Board, and having those benchmarks, even as imperfect as they are, a lot of us were watching basketball last night. Having the free throw percentage doesn't necessarily predict the LeBron over someone else, but at least having something standard can sometimes be helpful overall. Shannon, let's move on to on the getting back on the road, and then how you're reigniting, and I like to use the word reimagining engagement. You know, what kind of data are you using as you reach out to impact your yield, but also as you now look for your next class of students? What are some ways that you're communicating?
Yeah, I think the pandemic taught us, at least for my institution, but I'm sure there's many here, that the face-to-face recruitment is still important. I think, 2 years ago, we were like, oh, maybe we don't have to spend money to fly people around the world. I don't think that's the case. I think we've realized that that's very critical to what we do. But the digital virtual stuff, I don't think is going away. And I think we were all forced to kind of get a little bit better at that when we might not have, if there was not a global pandemic. And so I know for my own team, there's a lot of excitement to get back out, doing some of the travel and the in-person meeting students and counselors and parents. And we've already had a few people out traveling. And so there's that excitement, but we're trying to figure out, and part of my job is, yeah, we all want to get out there. Get me on a plane. Part of my job is figuring out what that balance is. We don't have extra resources, right? It's not like I can go to my leadership team and say, well, we need to do all the digital and all the in-person. So therefore I need twice as many staff and twice as much of a budget. That's just not reality for any of us. And if it is reality for you, can you please hire me? Because that would be awesome. But that's, so we're trying to figure out, and the data I think is going to be integral there. My institution implemented a CRM in the summer of 2020, which has been really helpful for us because it is starting to give us some of those data points, particularly around, what of our virtual efforts are being are good, which ones are, should we be prioritizing going forward? I was talking to someone on my team today and they were like, this was a lot of work to do for a webinar that got 4 people. And I said, well, why are we doing that webinar? Like, cancel, right? Like, that's not, clearly there's not a demand for that specific topic right now. So let's put our efforts in the ones where there are, if we're talking about nurturing student relationships, that takes a lot of time. So, what methods are most effective? And, it's not just a blanket, let's fly to every country around the world and just go and visit high schools, but, where are we actually getting applications, but where are we yielding those students? Like, what's our conversion rate, right? Because you can send me 100 applications, but if I get no students out of that, what's the point, right? Like, it's a lot of work that just doesn't result in anything.
And traditionally, testing and those like data points would not only be valuable in evaluation, but could inform yield models, also inform outreach, the licensing of names and all that. I think as you were saying, Shannon, if the person who comes up with the next future of match, and I suspect it won't be email, it will be something else, but those sort of things that replace traditional testing models in terms of both predicting yield, but also telling folks where to go in terms of where they should engage, which schools. This, I think, will be something that I hope NACAC and International ACAC, our community, plays a big role in. Sean, last topic. It's not an easy one, and then maybe you can also give us where Cornell is in that kind of proportion of international students and where you see that going. But what's next? What's in your crystal ball? And do you have any big reveals? Can you tell us the big Cornell news?
Always looking for secrets, Clay. I appreciate that about you. I mean, as far as our international numbers, the numbers are actually the same. We, during the pandemic, we've expanded our campus capacity for students and the associated resources. And so along with the growing applicant pool, because high tech equals high touch equals greater outreach, greater access. So everything's been sort of expanding, and I looking at our numbers really fast, I'll just say that the numbers really haven't changed all that much in terms of, even though international applications have been the largest of all the cohorts, I would say, certainly the one that's grown the most over the last couple of years, there's still a part of the pie, the class that's shaped in the different sort of colleges and different priorities. So as far as our testing situation, we're definitely going to be test optional and score free through the fall 24 applicant process. We still have to evaluate and talk about this. We are planning to do that over the next couple of years with data in hand, of course. And, the NCAA and MIT and the UC system and CSU system, have really kind of made this an even more challenging conversation because, and maybe this was never neat and clean to begin with, but it feels like there are definitely more considerations as we consider like what is the future of admissions review, contextual review, holistic review, localized program specific review at Cornell, relative to what can applicants provide and what's fair and what's not fair, across different cohorts. And do we want testing? Do we need it? I mean, we've never really had a good conversation nowhere that I've been about, whether or not testing helps with international admissions. Bobby talked about standardization today and that it can play a small role. I actually want to have that conversation because that's a big deal to me because, my international staff has turned over. And so, they don't know everything that I know necessarily, that the folks that have just come in. And so that's something else that's a part of all of this, but it's everything's still up in the air and there's certainly a lot more to consider. So I don't know what we're going to do after the process for fall 2024. I really have, I thought I knew, but then MIT happened and our engineering college is going through the same motions mentally, thinking about how they're going to do their work as MIT. And so that's also an internal complexity that, we need to try and figure out. So yeah, this is interesting. And we also have to consider what applicants want. I mean, there's a part of this that's about marketing and engaging students and not turning them away, and not being unfair, that, that seems soft, but we still have to consider that alongside of considering what do I need to do the best contextual review of a candidate that I possibly can for my institution.
And as we close, I want to give Bobby and Kuka and Shannon a chance to give a hopeful note, or maybe not or maybe a challenge note. So as you're thinking about what that close is that you're sending off to our recorded community, those that will be listening in, and we're thankful for those that have joined us live. I will build on what you're saying, Sean, that there's still a lot of questions in the air. I'm watching closely. I'm very curious, in the wake of, say, Georgia, Florida, and MIT, but will you see a Big Ten university or two revert back to testing? But one thing I'd be watching for is many of those universities were actually pioneers in test optional for international students before that. So, for example, Purdue, Michigan State, others, if they go back domestically, will they go back internationally? Because they have a long tradition of being that. And even MIT carved out, if you're not able to take the test, then they'll review it fine without it. And as the SAT goes digital, and ACT will probably make a major announcement soon as well, it's not clear whether that digital test will be as available. Especially internationally. So therefore, would that be a way for MIT or others to carve exceptions out with that? But now that I've built in some cushion, I'll start with Bobby, and then Kuka, and then Shannon for last word.
I knew you were gonna call on me. So I mean, I think the upside of all of this is that college admissions in so many ways has been forced to challenge the status quo in a way that I haven't been in the US for this long, but I'm guessing for what, like the last kind of 40 years or however long, this is nothing that has forced college admissions to kind of to look inwardly and to say, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is it the right thing to do? As the pandemic, and it goes for to Shannon's point about outreach, kind of there's been conversations about virtual versus in person, but we've been forced to question assumptions about why we do certain things in ways that we've never had to before. And that can never be a bad thing, to kind of to pause and say, but why are we doing this? Does this make sense? Is this the right decision? And so we're still coming to different conclusions on that. But I think it's been a pivotal moment in college admissions, to have that kind of that pause and to say, but does this make sense? Are we doing this the right way? So I think, however we come out of this, and I think we have been taught that we need to keep questioning. And I hope that kind of that mindset continues on no matter what direction we have within testing.
I'll echo that. Yeah. Bobby's wisdom echo. There we go. I'll throw out this, that a self-reported application to us has always been the request and the requirement as a public institution that receives, 200,000+ applications across the system. We read every single application with the hope of getting to know the student. And prior to when the requirement of an SAT or an ACT was there, students identified themselves as, oh, I'm a 1400 on the SAT. It's like, no, you're a person and you have talents and you have skills, and who are you and what will you bring to my university? That's now the focal point. So I'm kind of excited that students might sort of remove that as their identifier and instead place more emphasis on their hobbies, their talents, their skills, and their academic pursuits as reflected in their high school, wherever that high school may be around the globe. So I apologize to every counselor out there who wants to do, oh, I know if my kid's going to get into this university because their SAT scores are in this range. I know we're making life harder for you. I apologize profusely. But I also hope that you'll sort of turn that lens and make your student reflect inward on who they are outside of that test score. So good luck with that.
And Shannon.
Yeah, I think Canada's a little bit different, and I don't see us like all of a sudden being like every school is gonna be like, oh yes, we need testing, and that's not gonna happen. But I think the last 2 years has taught us we've had to be very flexible because we are admissions based only, right? We're grades only admission. And we've seen exams be canceled, we've seen school years just wiped out, and we've really had to accommodate. And that's not the fault of the student. So why are we going to penalize the student because they couldn't do their CBSE exams or whatnot? And so what has happened is we've had to be really flexible in how we're admitting students. And I think this is going to be a longer term project where we're now going to have faculties and the admissions teams looking at, well, how successful were those students that we didn't necessarily have all of the answers when we were admitting them. How successful were they over the course of their 4 years with us? And I think there's just going to be a lot more gray in admissions. So to Kuka's point, sorry to the counselors, but I think it's actually a good thing for students because I think we might not be so rigid. And I think at least in Canada, I think there might be a little more flexibility for students in the admission space.
That's perfect. And I think that's a perfect way to close, emphasizing that, the field, especially globally, will continue to be interconnected. It will continue to be ambiguous. I think that comfort in this transition and the ambiguity, but many of these decisions, as Kuka, you mentioned before, they're not arbitrary decisions. You're looking for key things related to match, and particularly around the academic record and context. There's other ways that you can find students for or fit in terms of your respective communities, but overall that academic record is what's core, and that there is ambiguity in the process. And as you're receiving more than 100,000 applications and we're getting to those single digits for some, but not all. I think that will be interesting. Thank you. What I'm going to do real quick is share my screen one more so that I can share the email addresses of all of the of our partners here. And let me just go ahead and find that. So here we go. So that we have that on screen. I'm going to scroll to the end just so it's a little bit larger. And again, I want to thank everyone for 1 second. Oops, there we go. So thank everyone. This is Kuka's email, Shannon's, Sean's, Bobby's, and mine. Feel free to email us. Also follow us on social media. Special thanks to Akil for his data. And so I added his contact information there. And then our next webinar will be 8 a.m. Let's see, on Wednesday, correct, Shannon?
Yep, there's one at 8 a.m. tomorrow and another one at 7 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow.
Perfect, featuring these all-stars. So please attend that. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful week and looking forward to seeing everyone in New Mexico. So take care. And Shannon, any final words before we close?
No, thank you to all of you, and thank you to Clay for coordinating us all. It was a great discussion, and please check out the recordings on the International ACAC website. There's lots of great content there. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.